Welcome to the screencast on Cultural Poetics. This is Chapter 9 of the Literary Criticism book. Cultural Poetics starts with the old historicism that basically said that history serves as a background to literature, in which the text is of primary importance, the literary text that is, and it mirrors the history of its times. Therefore, if you want to know about the text and more about the literature, you would study the history. Historical context then serves to shed light on the text. If we want to know what Dickens was really talking about in Little Dorrit or Christmas Carol, for example, you would study the history of Victorian England. But the point of studying the history is to understand the literature. This assumes that history, as written, is an accurate view of what really happened. Now, historians no longer hold to that view, as we'll see in just a minute. So we're going to have a new approach, prompted by the assumption that new critics, that meanings reside in texts alone. They viewed these texts as autotelic artifacts. Hopefully you remember that from your test. That is, an object with an independent existence of its own. Meaning then is contained in the text itself, not the author, the reader, or the culture that produces the text. It did not allow for questions about how a text is formed, what literature is, what do we mean by this literature, and whose interests it serves. So questions about where do texts come from? What is a literary text? And who is this text helping out? Those questions prompted then a new approach. Further, Cultural Poetics accepted post-structuralist assumptions. Now, post-structuralism includes deconstruction, which we've already talked about, but also psychoanalysis, Marxism, feminism, which we will get to in a little bit. So their assumptions that many factors affect the writing, the production, and the printing of texts, and thus their meaning. And they rejected the tendency for post-structuralist theories to leave the text in aporia or undecidability. If we have this nice structure made of Legos and we take it all apart and leave it scattered in pieces on the table, what's the point? We need some way to put it back together. And as we said when we were talking about deconstruction, the point of deconstruction is to clear center stage, to make room for a new approach, the ability to see the text in more than one way. So in the beginning of deconstruction, you just tore the text down, left the pieces on the table. People came along and said, not really satisfying. So the way it is now used is to push aside the accepted standard controlling interpretation to make room for another one. And cultural poetics is one of the schools of criticism that enable you to build up a new structure, give you a new interpretation. And again, aporia is the idea that text has many possible meanings. So, new historicists, that was their original name, sought to place the text back into its cultural context and thus limit the number of possible meanings. Because as we said and saw in deconstruction, there's all kinds of possible meanings. But which ones are likely? And that's what they went back to the cultural context to try to discover. New historicism, first of all, declares that all history is subjective. It's written by people whose personal biases affect their interpretation of the past. And I'm sure you all have heard the old saying that history is written by the winners. That's part of this subjectivity. Secondly, this idea that a purely objective view of history is impossible. Even today, with the advent of television cameras, total objectivity is impossible, because when I point the camera one direction, what I'm seeing here does not show me what's happening off camera. So where I point the camera is itself a subjective decision about what is important, what needs to be recorded versus what is not being recorded, because the camera isn't pointing there. merely choosing what to record is itself an act of interpretation. And here we have Calvin and Hobbes. History is the fiction we invent to persuade ourselves that events are knowable and that life has order and direction. So, history then is one of many discourses or ways of seeing and thinking about the world. It is a discourse that we tend to value for political reasons. But there are many other discourses out there, including sociology, the study of large groups of people, politics, religion, sports, even humor. All these things are discourses. And humor and politics have really come together in interesting ways in our society in recent years. In the last election, for example, more people got their political information, information about what was happening on the political scene from the Colbert Report or other humorous shows than from serious news outlets. Really interesting development. Rather troubling in some ways, too. Cultural Poetics, then, sees texts as culture in action, and it blurs the distinction between artistic production and other kinds of social events. Hence, the publication of A Modest Proposal was a political event. And if you remember A Modest Proposal, that's Jonathan Swift's treatise about how to solve the problem of poverty and hunger in Ireland. It's let's eat the babies. We study it now as a piece of literature, but when it was first published, it was definitely a political event. But by the same token, the inauguration of President Bush or President Obama, any president, any leading figure, is an aesthetic event that's full of symbolism, structure, and imagery. Many of the same things we talk about in terms of a literary text. So, is it a text or is it history? And where is the line between the two? All texts then are seen as social documents that reflect and respond to their historical situation. And this is probably the key to this type of criticism. Yes, it does reflect the culture, almost like a mirror. But it doesn't just reflect it. It reacts to it. It responds to it. It influences it. So we study the historical and cultural context to see where the text came from, but we also study the text and the history to see how the text influenced or changed the culture, the history. Texts, therefore, are battlegrounds where author, reader, society, customs, and institutions negotiate competing ideas. So I remember seeing in the first years of Obama's presidency a picture of Michelle Obama serving at a soup kitchen and all these homeless people taking pictures of her with their smartphones, which then led to a huge political furor about welfare and poverty, and should we be helping these people if they've got money to afford a several $100 cell phone. So that text, that picture, that news event becomes this battleground where competing ideas about helping the poor and what does poverty mean get debated and they compete. Same thing can happen in a literary text. We talked about A Modest Proposal. Another famous one is Uncle Tom's Cabin, the issue of slavery. Thus, the term cultural poetics fit the developing movement better than new historicism, because we are really talking about culture and not just history. One of the famous figures is Michel Foucault. He taught that history is not linear. Now, this flies in the face of our Christian worldview, which sees history as not just linear, but also teleological. That is, it has a beginning, creation, but it also has an end, the last judgment. And we're moving from beginning to end. It's not cyclical. We don't come back. It's a steady progression. Foucault said, no, history is not linear, and it is not teleological. Teleological means it's moving toward a set end, the last days Armageddon, the Second Coming, all of those prophecies. So it's not really going anywhere. It's not linear, not a straight line, and it has no end, no intent, no purpose, no goal. Those are the ideas involved in teleological. History, therefore, cannot be explained through cause and effect. And again, this is through a lot of post-structuralist, postmodern thought. You can't explain what happens in history through cause and effect. And again, that flies in the face of what we've believed and accepted about history for many years. History, rather, is the complex interrelationship of a variety of discourses. That is, the ways people think and talk about the world. It's complex. It's not a straight line. It's not cause and effect. It's more of a web than a chain. Foucault went on to say that these discourses do not act randomly, but according to an episteme. Another French word, it could also be pronounced episteme. I prefer episteme. Episteme basically means that through language and thought, each period in history develops its own perceptions concerning the nature of reality, sets up its own standards of behavior, establishes a criteria for judging good and bad, and certifies which people articulate and protect the measure by which all truth is judged. So an episteme is all of that for a time period. And each time period then develops its own episteme. So when we talk about the Middle Ages versus the Renaissance versus Edwardian England versus Victorian, each of those periods is marked primarily by one of these epistemes. Its own perceptions, its own decisions about what reality is, what are the proper standards of behavior, what is good, what is bad, and who's in control of all of that. So that episteme becomes a very key concept. To discover the episteme then of a period, the historian must expose each layer of society that forms the episteme. So now we're entering into a major metaphor for cultural poetics, and that metaphor is that of an archaeological dig. And we're going to dig down through the layers to expose the culture that was present at a time in the past. So we're going to identify the discourses and the practices of the period. We're going to identify the interrelationships between those discourses and practices, and we're going to identify the interaction of our own episteme, because remember, we are writing from a particular culture with our own ideas about what is good and bad and who controls these evaluations and what we value. And all of that affects and shapes the way we see history. So we need to look at two different epistemes. The one that we're looking through as if they were our glasses, the idea of looking through rose-colored glasses or rose-tinted lenses, it affects what you see, but also then that other episteme that's further in the past. So you have to keep both of them in mind because they do interact. Clifford Geertz then comes along and talks about thick description. And this is the seemingly insignificant details present in any cultural practice. His idea is that by focusing on these details, one can reveal the inherent contradictory forces at work within a culture. And here we're kind of back to deconstruction, those contradictions that are present in a text, but now we're looking at it in terms of a culture. So here with the thick description, we may be looking at diaries, we may be looking at recipe books, we may be looking at all sorts of documents, even train tables for the Victorian period. And each separate discourse then of a culture has to be uncovered and analyzed in the hope of showing how it interacts with all of the other discourses. And that's that idea of the thick description. We're not just looking at history written in history books. We're looking at all the other different sources of history, even the ones that people don't usually consider to be history. And with that, we're going to be finished up. This is part 1.